Welcome in, folks. As you're filtering in, we'll be getting started shortly. Welcome. Glad that you're here. More people filtering in. So excited to see all of you joining in tonight. Just another couple of minutes here as we have people filter in and find their way through the links. Before we get started, thanks for being here, everyone. It's so wonderful to see your faces, friends I see, and also faces I don't recognize. That's exciting. We will be getting started here in just another minute or two. Again, thank you so much for finding your way here when there's so many places you could be at this time of day on this Tuesday night. I'm so thrilled to have you here with us. Hi, Shauna. Connie, good to see you. Martha, nice to see you. I see your name on the internet a lot, but I don't ever really see your face very often. Josh, I think I recognize your name from some recent social media interaction. Lori, nice to see you. Kenneth Tanner, what joy is this? That's exciting. I'm so glad to see you, sir. All right.
Ready to go, Mark?
I think so.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. We're so excited that you're here tonight. I'm Susan Carson, and among many things I get to do in life, I got to be Mark's book launch coach. So everybody who was in the launch team, hello. So glad you're here. We're going to take some time tonight to thank you and to celebrate the fact that Walking Otherward, look, I have a copy in my hands, is actually out in the world. People are receiving it, reading it, getting ready for groups to take groups through this, to take an individual journey through the Lenten season. And we're super excited. So, congratulations, Mark.
Yay.
Yay. It's a big deal. So, welcoming those here in Zoom. There are also those watching live on YouTube, and we're excited you're all here. We're going to celebrate and we're going to extend the conversation with our guests tonight. So, if you're here tonight, I'm assuming you know Mark. Mark is pastor of Bridge City Community Church, hailing from Oregon, author of multiple books now, The Wisdom of Your Heart, Journaling for Spiritual Growth. You've written other things. Um, and you're bringing this goodness to the world for
Yeah.
us. So thank you. We are joined tonight by Brian Zahn. Brian is the pastor of Word of Life Church, hailing from Missouri. Author of 11 books is what your bio says, Brian. I don't know how you do all that, but you do. Most recently, The Wood Between the Worlds, maybe most famously, Sinners in the Hands of a Loving God, just a couple of your titles. And you wrote the preface for Mark's book as well. And Bradley Jerzak is here with us, or will be probably any minute. He's got a cold going on. So, Bradley is the principal of St. Stephen's University in St. Stephen's, New Brunswick, Canada. And St. Stephen's is a graduate school of theology, peace, and reconciliation committed to forming lives in justice, beauty, and compassion. That's actually where Mark and I first met.
I'm
Mhm.
also her supervisor, and I was Mark's supervisor on their thesis. How's this thesis coming, Susan? I'll
Oh
wait for your next
gosh.
chapter.
We don't really have to talk about that right now. This is
Mark's was
Mark's night.
amazing. Mark's was amazing.
Mm, so good. I want to read it sometime. I can imagine that your thesis might have intersected with the work that you did on this
Yeah,
book.
it's
Yeah.
hard to not have the same brain, right? When all the things connect to all the things, right?
Yes. Yep. Yep. Bradley, as well, is an author of many books. And we're going to have a conversation tonight. And if you're here in Zoom, first of all, I'm going to ask you, please make sure that you're muted because Mark is recording this and we'll edit it for a podcast. But we do want you, if you have questions as we're conversing. Mark's going to do a reading and then offer some questions. The four of us are going to dialogue a bit, and then we're going to open it up. So enter questions that you have in the chat, and hopefully we'll have time to address at least some of them towards the end of our evening. So that's what's happening. And I just want to take a minute to specifically thank the launch team members who are here. I don't know that there's any way to fully communicate you, but the four authors here, I'm an author too, just can't communicate to you how much it means when you post on social media, when you write reviews on Goodreads, when you write reviews on Amazon. This is how people find these books. You're helping spread the word so that people can encounter the goodness in these books. So thank you so much for everything that you have done. The first 60 days of a book's life are just critical. Most of the copies will find their way to readers in those first 60 days. So if you haven't reviewed yet, when you get your copy, when you order and you get your copy, please do that because that helps Mark a ton. So thank you.
Yeah, I just add to
Yeah.
I had, and I think many of us have this idea that writing books is this very solitary process. And there certainly are parts of it that you got to do on your own. but it is such a team endeavor. It requires a community, and the folks who are willing to read, the folks that are willing to share. I've said this multiple times. I think it's a minor miracle when the right book finds the right reader. Like it feels like a Holy Spirit thing. It feels completely out of your control. And the best way that we can influence that is when people who find a book that's meaningful to them share that with other people. And there's just no possible way for me to express how grateful and indebted I am to those of you who gift copies, share copies, tell people about it, write reviews so that future readers can decide if the book is for them. Like that, I'm just so deeply grateful. It matters so much.
Absolutely. So, Mark, you're going to share a couple
Yeah.
passages from the book with us. So we get to hear the book in your voice.
Yes, just a little bit. We're not here for my own self-indulgence, but I thought I'd read just a couple brief things from the book, from Walking Otherward, that can kind of set the stage, hopefully, for the conversation that we're going to have. The whole book, it's a devotional. It's walking along with Jesus toward the cross, but there's a very strong viewpoint that that I'm wanting to share. And so these readings, I think, get at that. So the first reading is just simply the dedication. If you are one of the many who, whether through intuition or study, are convinced that there must be more to the way of Jesus than what Christianity in the modern West is offering, this book is for you. You are not wrong. And then a little later in the introduction, I say a little bit about what I'm trying to do with this book and really all of my writing. With this book and everything I write, I am exploring Christian spirituality in a way that opens up possibilities. I want to broaden the theological conversation for folks whose primary spiritual imagination has been shaped by fundamentalism. I want to offer a hand to those who have been burned by institutional religion, but who are still compelled by Jesus. My vision of the way of Jesus has shifted radically since I was a pastor's kid in the 80s in the US Midwest. The other-centered, co-suffering way of Jesus is so much better than what I was handed. The more I walk toward others in a posture of humility and grace, the more I find God's presence. I think you'll find that that is true as well. And then just one section from one of the days. This is reflecting on an interaction that Jesus has with his disciples at the beginning of the Jerusalem road. And Jesus has told his disciples that where they're headed, he's going to be killed. And they, represented by Peter, they don't take it very well. At a turning point in Mark's gospel, Jesus tells his friends that soon those in power are going to kill him. His friends don't receive this news well. After all, Jesus had only just healed a blind man, and people were saying he might be the Messiah. His crowds were growing. Peter, the leader among the disciples, pushed back in a private rebuke to Jesus. I imagine Peter telling Jesus that he was being too negative. How could Jesus build a following by saying things like that? Jesus' response is startling. Get behind me, Satan. Jesus then claims Peter's mind is set on human things rather than the things of God. Now, I expect Peter was surprised by this, maybe even hurt. How could Peter's desire to support Jesus' success be bad? Not just a mistake, but something satanic. Considering this context, I wonder if the human things Jesus refers to are our narratives of success and strength. More influence, more money, more power. For a good person, don't these open up the opportunities to do more and bigger good things? After all, isn't that what a blessing looks like? More happiness, bigger accomplishments, more prosperity in whatever way we imagine it. Surely these things show that God is at work. At least some seem to think so. In this interaction with Peter and throughout his life and teaching, Jesus points in a different direction. He challenges us to set down our instinct of self-protection and desire for elevation. In this interaction, Jesus begins to talk about his soon to be experienced cross. Like Jesus, we are encouraged to become cross bearers. This is a shift of mindset. Trade vengeance for forgiveness. Trade personal security for bearing one another's burdens. Trade heroic individualism for a community of mutual care. Trade the pursuit of more influence or money or power for the pursuit of more intimacy, generosity, and compassion. Jesus sums this all up by saying that if we want to save our lives, we must lose them first. The way of Jesus always passes through death. It's natural to want to avoid discomfort. That's human. But at the same time, it's a bit weird for followers of the one who walked to the cross to focus their lives on avoiding discomfort. As far as Jesus is concerned, the cross is the only way to life. We lose our lives to find them. We die to live again. These words are not about eternity, or at least not just about eternity. Thank you very much. Thanks for indulging me to read my own words.
So good, Mark. I think it's always fun to hear an author's writing in their own voice. So thanks for bringing that to us. And I don't know that you could have had any idea how timely this book would actually be, weirdly timely, given everything that's going on in the world right now and this very specific message of other-centered, co-suffering love. So we're going to dive into that together tonight. I hope you guys are buckled in, because we're going to wade right into the middle of it with some really great questions. So again, we're going to start with about probably a 30-minute conversation with Brian, Bradley, Mark, maybe me a little bit. And then we'll open it up for questions if you have any. I'll keep my eye on the chat. But just know we're going to dialogue for about 30 minutes, and you're welcome to drop questions in that chat at any point. Yeah. And again, please keep yourself on mute. So we're going to move to our conversation. So I'll hand it back to you, Mark.
All right. Well, I am really excited to have a chat with this crew here tonight, for a number of reasons. But I just want to take a moment as we jump to the questions to acknowledge the impact that Brian and Bradley have had on me personally and on the book that you all have. I think that it's not an exaggeration to say that the book wouldn't exist without them. And it's definitely not an exaggeration to say that the thought behind it wouldn't be what it is without their influence. I've been following Brian since 2017, I think. I think maybe Sinners in the Hands of a Loving God was my first experience of Brian, and I was sort of taken aback to hear this guy who sounded like a charismatic preacher who was saying things that were so in line with intuitions I'd been having that I didn't stereotypically place into the mouth of a pastor on the stage of a big church. And yet, following that path, and since having read all of his books, I've just been challenged so deeply to keep the gospel picture of who Jesus is central, not just as my picture of Jesus, but as the way that I imagine God entirely. And so because of that, Brian's been kind of a mentor at a distance, one of those folks that you've got the books on the shelf and you've read them some multiple times and you listen to what they say on the internet and consider them a mentor. And then last year, thanks to Bradley, I had the opportunity to do a study tour in Greece and Turkey that Brian was on. And so we talked about early church fathers, and we walked through, ancient Greek cities that Paul was in, and we talked about, what it must have been like to be there, and how the dots connect from those places to our own ministries today. And I got to see Brian as a real human being, not just a voice on a stage somewhere. And I really loved that experience and came to trust him at a deeper level. And so then, when he was willing to write the foreword to this book, it was just an incredible joy and honor for me. And my connection to Brian is wrapped up in my connection to Bradley. I was thinking back, I honestly can't remember when I ran across Bradley first. I kind of suspect it might be through the Open Table Circle. The Open Table conferences, kind of started here in Portland. And the crew of folks that were involved in that, that might be where I originally ran into you, Bradley. I'm not really sure. But very much like Brian, some of Bradley's books just really stunned and cracked open my brain. His Beautiful Gospel series put pieces together that I had been wrestling with from scripture and the footnotes of other books that I'd been reading and spiritual intuition that I'd been having, and just really gave me permission to name some things that I hadn't been brave enough to name. And then COVID came along, and Bradley suckered me into a master's degree program. That's not true. It's not his fault. But I ended up in a master's degree program, which has been one of the highlights of my adult life. And there I got to meet the human being Bradley and become friends. And so the thought process, the theology behind this book is deeply shaped by both of these guys. And I'm just so deeply indebted, and I'm really, really thrilled and honored to be able to even have a short conversation tonight about what this way might mean for us as followers of Jesus. So thanks, guys.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
Happy to be here. And yeah, the only correction I'd make is we're dear friends. Dear friends.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you. We're dear friends. I feel that way. All right. So here's the big question. It's a way, way too big of a question for us to solve, but I think it will give us a space to talk about some things that are important. So we find ourselves, as Susan mentioned, we find ourselves in kind of a dire historical moment, it seems. Political disagreement that's always been, present in society has kind of metastasized into sort of a dogmatic polarization. Certain leaders, some of them Christian leaders, seem to be aggressively pushing toward a kind of supremacist regime where certain kinds of Christianity are the official religion of at least the country that I'm part of. I know we have folks in the Zoom tonight from multiple countries. And there's a lot of anger. There's a lot of perspective that the people who disagree with me are my enemy, and they want bad things for me, and so we must fight. There's a lot of this in the air right now. And I think that is leaving a lot of us worried and wondering what to do. I think Christians in particular, as I've had many conversations in the last few weeks, are wondering what to do. What is the Christ-like thing to do in this moment? And so I wanted to start by just asking your thoughts on why it seems like in so many places, the church, and I'm using that language to refer sort of broadly to all of our siblings around the world, why does the church seem to fall so easily into the temptation to collude with this mess? Or, on the other hand, seem to be standing so passively watching it all unfold? What do you think about that?
I think it's very easy right now to be overwhelmed. But I'm not despairing in any way. I think I think it's important to understand that when the New Testament talks about our citizenship is in heaven, that's to be taken actually quite seriously.
Hmm.
Paul writes that as a Roman citizen, I mean, he knows about, and it's valuable to him. It gets him out of a few scrapes here and there. I mean, eventually the empire is going to cut his head off, but I mean, he's able to use that citizenship to his advantage on multiple occasions. But when Paul says our citizenship is of heaven, he really means that. And he really thinks that way.
Hmm.
But the empires of this world are always going to be to some degree or another, Antichrist. That's the nature of the beast. I mean that's kind of a double entendre there, the idiom and then just the nature of the beast. Um, so in some ways, I think we're maybe surprised when we shouldn't be.
Hmm.
I'll speak frankly here for a moment. I think that whereas I think maybe a lot of people who might be joining us tonight would be comfortable with speaking of America as an empire. I've been doing that for 20 years, and I think people get that. But I think maybe we thought it was like maybe a little better.
Right. A good
Probably
empire.
really is. Um, Now, what concerns me most is to see my brothers and sisters sometimes, as you already alluded to, colluding with the powers that be, and that's been a mistake the church has made repeatedly for the past 17 centuries. I wish we could get beyond that. But that's where my real concern lies. I'm not a politician. I don't belong to a party. I do live in America, and so I'm affected by various things, but when the day is done, I'm really a citizen of the kingdom of the heavens. And so my response as a pastor has been to a certain extent. I'll say this and I'll probably get pushback, but I live in the world of pushback, so that's all right.
Right.
When things were very dire in Germany in the 1930s, and when there were uh, some critical events that portended heading into a dark direction, some seminary students asked Karl Barth, "What should we do?" And he said, "Preach like nothing has happened." By which he meant not to be naive, not to be escapist, but to lean into the gospel of Jesus Christ. Let Jesus do the heavy lifting. Uh, Point people. Jesus shines through. And if we can just draw people's attention to the living Christ, then we don't have to do all the work and change all the minds. Let Jesus shine. And so that's what I like about your book. And I like it that I mean, I like devotions. Let me just riff on this for a moment, then I'll get out of the way here. Um, so this is a book, we're launching it at the beginning of Lent because it's a book to be read during Lent. I'm old enough to remember when Lent was an exclusive Catholic thing.
Right. Yes, for sure.
There was, I mean, maybe a high Anglican here and there would talk about Lent, but for the most part, outside of the Catholic world or the Anglo-Catholic world, nobody was talking about Lent. That has changed, and it's been changed dramatically, increasingly, year by year. I think it indicates that we long for rhythm and roots. And so we're drawn to the church calendar with its rhythms and its rootedness in the gospel story of Jesus Christ. And so those sorts of things, I mean, just inviting people to really engage with Jesus by seriously considering the gospel texts. That's super important pastoral work. This coming Sunday's, Transfiguration Sunday, I was reading some church fathers on this today. Origen says, "Do you want to see the transfiguration?" He says, you can't climb up on that mountain that they were on, but what you can do is go to the Gospels.
Hmm.
Pay attention, and you will see Jesus being transfigured before your eyes. And in his transfiguration, we find our transfiguration. So I don't, Mark, I don't even remember what the original question was, but I got started on something and I said something. So
You
I'll
did.
get out of the way and let Brad and Susan help us out here.
Well, before I do want to hear from Brad and Susan, but I will just connect the dot because as you talked about the value of Lent and focusing on Christ, one of the questions that we're going to have next, I think you answered, which is what are our resources as we face this time of chaos and uncertainty, and that's a perfect example, right? Like we've got to go deeper into a real and nuanced and careful reflection on who Jesus is.
Well, and let Jesus shine. I mean, you do this in your book, Mark. It's we're engaging with Jesus. I mean, each reading is something about what Jesus is doing.
Yes.
Because during Lent, what we're doing is we're actually on the road with Jesus, headed towards Jerusalem. You set it up perfectly. Uh, you know, that we're to take up our cross and follow Jesus. There is a resistance to that because that sounds like loss and pain and death and suffering, and which sometimes it does involve that. But we know that on the other side of that is resurrection. And so I don't think we have to feel like we have to change everybody's mind. And if you do feel that way, well, good luck,
Right.
that'll drive you insane. Rather, our work is more modest, and it's to gently but persistently point people to Jesus. And then trust that Jesus, because he actually is the living Christ, he can be the one to bring about change that we can't bring about.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
One thing that Brian didn't address in your original question, and that may be a good thing, is like what made the church so susceptible to this? And maybe we can just nod to it on our way to these other things that I think are more important, because it's speculative. But I do think that you've mentioned chaos, you've mentioned confusion. And I think we're in that period on a grand scale. So there's a temptation that comes when you feel like things are slipping, and the temptation is to power, and specifically to power over.
Yes, right.
And when you can get a little whiff that maybe we could have that if we get in bed with partisan politics, maybe we could have some certitude, even maybe it's better just to be told what to do than to wonder what to do. And maybe we could make, that those are some of the temptations I think that make people susceptible. But I think Brian's exactly right that the solution then isn't that, well, it's our job to go fix that.
Right. Right.
So I feel like I've had he mentioned despair. I've been having this thought that we are both tempted to despair and invited to despair. And so the temptation to despair is to see all of this and and this is where you go quiet on it, right? It's just all hopeless. I'm tempted to paralysis, to despondency, to resentment. These are the kind of, because I'm despairing of good things, right? But I think Jesus is inviting us to despair too, to despair of fixing things the way the world fixed things, to try to push back at partisan politics with partisan politics, to choose our emperor instead of the other one. Despair of that. And then just following exactly what Brian said, I think the subtitle of your book really matters to this. So can you read it for me, the subtitle?
Yeah, 40 Meditations on Following Jesus' Path of Other-Centered Co-Suffering Love.
So following Jesus, and it's a path that I identify specifically with the Sermon on the Mount, and that is infused with a way of being that is other-centered and co-suffering. Those are words all of us have really embraced. So I'll say one thing about that. While we preach the gospel, we also enter into a kind of allyship, which is absorbing the violence of others in order to put a stick in the spokes of the wheel of the cycle of violence. And I'm getting this from my colleague, Andrew Klager, but we can't impose that calling on others, especially the victims of oppression.
Right.
So I don't say to let's say a Gazan, you need to practice co-suffering love and radical blah, blah, blah. No, that's for me to do.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that Andrew says is we cannot change the world quickly, but we also know we're dripping in privilege to say, take the slow route.
Right. Yes.
When there are urgent needs. So it's also, but it's also true that the kind of exercises we do as we're journaling using your book and deliberately, slowly following the path of Jesus, that's required if we're going to have anything sustainable in the terms of transforming. But transforming what? I guess I find great appeal to more like I'm not out to fix the world. I am out to participate in an alternative society that looks like the way of Jesus.
You know,
Mhm.
I
if
got
we
that from Brian.
if we forsake patience and think I have to speed this up, I have to
Right.
speed Jesus up. That's how you end up, that's how you become Judas.
Right. Right.
I'll just take a moment. I won't take long with this. We all know that Judas betrayed Jesus with a kiss. Why? Why a kiss? Why does Judas come up and greet him and say, "Hail, Rabbi," and give him a typical greeting kiss? If all he's doing is just doing it for the money, go on, take the money and run, he just stands in the shadows and points and says, "It's that guy right there. Right? That's that guy. All right, see ya. I'm out of here. I got my 30 pieces of silver." I think that's not what's going. Judas wants to be a disciple. He wants to force Jesus to fight.
Hmm.
Back Jesus into a corner, and then he will use the miraculous power that Judas knows that he has to launch this war against the occupying Romans. And he wants to force Jesus to go. He's tempting Jesus to do what the devil tempted Jesus to do in the third temptation in the wilderness. And I think we have to resist that. And if I'm thinking about Alan Kreider's book, The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. The early church, they grew up under nothing but despotic, oppressive regimes. Um, but they were just patient. They believed that Jesus was Lord and that the world would be saved, but they just didn't see it necessarily as their job to force it to happen. What they were more interested in was creating alternative communities within the Roman Empire that lived by a completely different ethic, a completely different vision of how humans could share life together. And so their own communities were this alternative society that Jesus called the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God. And I'm always struck that Origen, in his debate with Celsus, the pagan philosopher and polemicist against Christianity, Origen's ultimate apologetic is you don't believe that our communities are really different and that they actually do function through love, through actual altruistic love, then come to our churches and see, just check it out. And I wonder how many of us would dare to say, here is my ultimate argument that the kingdom of Christ is real. You can see it lived out day by day in our local churches. I think some would be nervous to do that, but I think that's the hope, to actually become communities of Christ-like, co-suffering, other-oriented, as you say in your book, love that actually plays out,
Yes.
not in perfection, but in an actual real experience that people can see with their own two eyes.
Right, right. It's organic. It's not mechanized. It's this is Bradley's language. It's rooted in consent and participation rather than hierarchical control. It's vulnerable. Maybe this is the tying point back to when Bradley said that the struggle maybe that causes the church to fall into this is that fear that comes up, that uncertainty, and the struggle with the way of Jesus, this other-centered co-suffering way, is that it is also a call to vulnerability, and that's not the thing I most want when I'm feeling at loose ends, right? I want a guarantee. I want to feel secure. I want to know that my investment's going to pay off, and the call of the cross is the opposite. It's vulnerability. It requires trust that God is actually at work in the larger picture, and it isn't up to me to make the outcome be the outcome. I'm participating in what God is doing, and that's a very vulnerable position to take.
That's what your book's about, Mark.
Yeah, thank you. You're right. I think it is. Susan, is there anything in your thoughts that this is sparking?
Well, fear, I think, is at the heart of it. And I just keep the thing that keeps coming to mind a lot for me is a quote I heard, I think initially from John Philip Newell, who's a Celtic theologian. And he said, if you see turmoil and travail in the world, move towards it because something is trying to be born. And so it seems to me that in this, there's something revelatory, like the things we sort of smelled and knew were there, but didn't think could really happen here are happening here. And it's really clear, right? It's out in the open. And now we have the chance, right, to decide who we're going to be as people of Jesus. I think the whole idea of co-suffering love as Americans, as maybe as Western Christians, I don't know, we don't really have a great place in our theology for suffering at all. So to learn the way of co-suffering love, I think you learn it through suffering, and I don't know what that means, and that's not like happy news, but it just seems to me that some things can be born and shaped in us through this that might not be born and shaped in any other way. And it's horribly uncomfortable. And the fear would drive us, right, in not great directions. And yet, other centered, right, moving towards the other, moving towards Jesus in this, moving towards one another. I think something is being born. So.
Yeah, that word co-suffering, I mean, it's the literal meaning of compassion, empathy, sympathy. And weirdly, lately, public leaders and teachers and preachers have actually pronounced that empathy is a sin. And I'm like, what happened there? And it seems to me that the thing we're pushing back against is the construction of a Christianity that's the opposite of the Beatitudes.
Mm.
And
Right.
maybe we'll get more into that at some point tonight too. But I moving forward for me, I think for those who don't want to be susceptible to the lure of power over Christianity, I do recommend praying the Beatitudes every day. You just set an alarm on your clock or your phone and pray them every day. And I'm telling you, it is a furnace of discernment like none other. There is no power over theology or prophecy that can get through the first three Beatitudes. They will be fried before you get there. And it's such an amazing shield of faith then from the three temptations of the Grand Inquisitor, who said, the church needs to say yes to what Jesus said no to. And we're like, no, we won't, because we have this shield that's been given, this furnace of discernment in these words.
So, yeah, let me keep riffing on that. I mean, we get going on Dostoevsky and we're just going to go. Um, so in the Grand Inquisitor, Ivan is trying to destroy his brother Alyosha's faith. And, he comes up with this parable in the Grand Inquisitor and Jesus. And of course, Jesus never says anything. But at one point, Alyosha breaks in and says, you're praising Christ. You're not reviling him. And Ivan doesn't disagree. And then you have that dramatic episode at the end where Christ simply kisses the Inquisitor, and the kiss burns in his heart. He's still clinging to his old idea, but it burns in his heart. My point from that is, if we can just keep driving the conversation toward Jesus, quoting the Beatitudes, quoting the Sermon on the Mount, without necessarily trying to make people see the point, but just let Jesus be Jesus, he tends to win the day. He definitely is often above the fray. And so I would say the vast majority of non-Christian people who are witnessing what's occurring in the present moment under the flag of Christian nationalism, they know that Jesus has nothing to do with that.
Yes.
Now, what it really does is it reviles the church and it gives the church a terrible reputation. But Jesus somehow stays above that. I mean, he really does. People know. They'll say things like, I don't know much about religion. I don't know much about Christianity, but I know Jesus isn't like that. And how do they know? But they're right. They do know. And they're accurate in that. And so I just refuse to hand over Jesus to those that want to use him for an imperial theology. But I'm really, in one sense, not even that worried about it, because that only works within that little group. although the group actually may be quite large, but I mean, it doesn't influence the wider world.
Hmm.
And so I don't know, I'm just banging the drum for let's keep our focus on Jesus. That can sound cliche, but I don't mean it that way. And I keep, want to just bring everything back to Mark's book. But that's why, you got these 40 meditations where Jesus gets to be Jesus. And then Mark helps us to maybe consider what the implications of that are. But the best part is that, the light of Christ just shines.
Hmm. I want to just back a second up on two things. One is that you kind of blitzed through the Grand Inquisitor scene, and I want to just real quick give a very brief Wikipedia version because I don't know if everyone's familiar. I feel like the Grand Inquisitor is maybe one of the most important pieces of prophetic literature in the modern age. It's just one scene out of the larger book, The Brothers Karamazov. There's a version of it that is on YouTube that you can watch that's a filmed version. And the story very simply is Jesus shows up in a Spanish city. It's the 15th century or something like that. And he begins doing the things that Jesus does in the Gospels. And as a result of that, he gets arrested. And the entire scene takes place in the dungeon where he is being confronted by the bishop or the abbot, the head Christian dude.
Cardinal Grand Inquisitor.
Right. He's being confronted by the Grand Inquisitor. And Jesus is sitting in the room, and the Grand Inquisitor is talking to him. And Jesus never says anything in the entire scene. The Grand Inquisitor is the only one who talks. And in short, the Grand Inquisitor basically says, the temptations that you faced in the wilderness, the three temptations, you made the wrong choice. And what people actually need from you would have been for you to make the other choice. But you didn't do that. You failed. But now we are entrusted with the responsibility to pick that up and do what you couldn't do. And so we will give the people certainty. We will give the people rules so that they don't have to think for themselves. We will make sure that they know they are taken care of. And that's all that they want from. That's what they want. That's what they need. And you didn't give that to them. Does that feel like a fair, brief summary?
Exactly. Very good.
Yeah. So
I mean, his argument is that Christ has too high opinion of humanity, that Christ tries to give them freedom, but people don't want freedom. And so the cardinal representing more or less atheistic religious leaders who are just the religious arm of imperial power, or at least in league with imperial power, have tried to undo what Jesus was trying to do.
Hence, timely.
very pragmatic
Yeah.
picture, right? Like that we're using faith, we're using the way of Jesus, and we're giving the people what they want, and that's the right thing. And I think what's prophetic about this scene and matters for the moment we find ourselves in is that the temptation in the wilderness, the three temptations, are really, I think, what the church is facing now,
Yes, exactly.
right? Like we're being asked, what kind of people will we be in the world? Will we be people who use power? Will we be people who compel agreement through overwhelming people's perspective and experience? Will we be people who depend on spectacle in order to overwhelm people's thoughts and compel them to do what we want? Or will we do something different? And the Gospels say that Jesus bested the devil in this temptation. And how did Jesus do it? By not going down that path.
Yeah.
It is tempting, right? That's the temptation of the hour. It is so easy to see the them in our us them dynamic and then just mirror them,
Yeah, right.
right? So they're using power over, so now I will. They're using attack and accusation and condemnation, so now I will. And it's very subtle, and it feels right and righteous, and it feels honest. And there is a place for praying the imprecatory psalms, but you only do that in the presence of Jesus as a way to confess the malice in your heart and have it expunged so that you don't do violence to the other.
Yeah.
And so I think it's always difficult. Again, I don't want to say that as a privileged person to others who are being oppressed, but it is for me to avoid becoming the thing I hate. So
The other place I want us to back up to, and then I'm going to hand this back to you, Bradley. You said that kind of maybe the best way to envision what this other-centered co-suffering path is the Beatitudes, and so you offered that as a resource. I'd like us to talk a little bit about that more, and maybe the general question of what are resources we have as followers of Jesus to stick to the other-centered co-suffering path when the temptation to the ways of power and coercion are so dominant for us right now.
Yeah, so of course, the Beatitudes are the first section of the Sermon on the Mount, and I would say that as Jesus' foundational sermon as he launches the kingdom in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5 to 7, it behooves us to know that sermon inside and out. And there are those who can help us do so. Unfortunately, there came a time in the church where people actually were teaching, probably since Luther, that we need to read the Sermon on the Mount as something we can't obey, and in fact shouldn't obey. It's meant only to cause us to despair, so we'll cast ourselves on the Gospels, or on the on grace. So you don't live the Sermon on the Mount. You're not even invited to. In fact, if you try to, you're probably forsaking grace. But what is the Sermon on the Mount?
Bonhoeffer's cheap grace.
Yeah,
cheap
Bonhoeffer
grace was attacking that, saying
yeah.
He knew that they'd gone there, and that's what Bonhoeffer, without saying it, is saying.
As a Lutheran,
the reason you can go to a Nazi rally on Saturday night and go to church on Sunday morning and feel no contradiction is because of cheap grace.
Yeah.
That the gospel is no longer something you live; it's just a means by which the grace of God exonerates whatever you do.
Yeah. And what does the sermon actually say, though? Well, many will say, Lord, Lord, and I'll say, I've never knew him, because you didn't do the things I told you to do. And so the wise man who builds his house on the rock at the end of that sermon is the one who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice. So but I start with the Beatitudes because they set up an orientation of the soul, of surrender to God, of lowliness of heart, of meekness, of a renunciation of ego. And our friend Ron Dart, he actually translates the first Beatitude this way: blessed are those, or the divine life is for those who have learned to say no to the demands of the ego. That's what it is. Poverty of spirit is a bankrupting of self-will. And so that's the thing. Is it going to be self-giving love, or is it going to be power over domination? You can't do both, right? So if we can just keep cleansing our own hearts with the Beatitudes, that'd be great. And on that, I would say some good resources. Jim Forrest has a book called Ladder of the Beatitudes that's magnificent. Ron Dart has a book called Beatitudes, Where Mountain Meets Valley. And there's a good book by a Quaker named Matthew Legge, Legge, called Are We Done Fighting? And it's a pushback against the whole power over thing and that temptation. But so I'm a Beatitudes guy. I think I've tried to pray it daily for now 15 years. And I do feel like it's a way to guard your heart, not only from, let's say, the ways of the empire, but also the ways of pushing back at the empire through self-will that just end up, you're hooked anyway. So yeah, that's kenosis, right? Self-emptying. Emptying what? Well, that urge to grab the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and instead come to the tree of life,
Right. As I was writing this, we actually had a text exchange fairly early in the manuscript process of this book, where I was trying to get my head around how to formulate language to make clear the contrast, right? That if the direction we're going is the other-centered co-suffering path of Jesus, what is the thing that we tend toward instead of that? And the language that came out of that text interaction was self-centered, ego-defending ambition, right? That this is the natural human state. I make decisions based on how they serve me. I do all kinds of different things to defend my egoic sense of self. I want to feel strong. I want to feel right. I want to feel secure. I want to feel loved. And so I do all of these things to defend my ego. And ambition is that I want everything to be getting better and growing, and I want to make a big change and all of that stuff. I'm driving it. I'm driving it, right? And then that's very natural to us as humans. And so in the contrast to that, maybe, I don't know if it's too arrogant to say, maybe that's a little bit of what Paul was getting at when he would use the word the flesh, right? But in contrast to that, the way of Jesus is other-centered. I'm going to consider how my actions and words in the world impact others. Like, I'm even going to consider that there are others, right? like that other people exist, that the world is not solely here for me. And then I'm going to think about how my words and actions and the things I participate in impact them. And then co-suffering, which doesn't necessarily mean that every one of these decisions is going to be actual suffering. It means burden bearing. Like, I'm coming along beside you. And if this decision or circumstance is putting a load on you, I'm going to come alongside and help bear that burden with you. Right. And maybe that's a way of understanding what the church ought to be up to in this moment. Like, that we ought to be a community of bearing one another's burdens, not just our burdens in the community, but the burdens of those around us that are being hard pressed in the culture that we find ourselves in. Susan, you've been quiet. I want you to make sure you are able to contribute if you've got more to.
Well, thanks. I'm trying to watch the chat and trying to watch the time. So I'm seeing lots of great conversation. I'm not seeing particular questions that haven't already been addressed. And so I'm wondering what a good way to sort of lead us towards a place to land this for folks. And I guess my desire would be maybe pastorally. How do we help people like move through the overwhelmed, move through all this, stay focused on Jesus? Are there some practical?
Well, my friend Tara has jumped in with a question that I think prompts that pastoral question. Her question says, she puts herself down a little bit and says, okay, I'll be brave, non-theologian here for sure. This is all great and feels right on a normal Tuesday, but that ain't now. So what is our role on the other-centered co-suffering path for us when wrongs are being perpetrated? What do we do? And I think that's the question, right? I will make a brief comment, and then I want to make sure we get some time from Bradley and Brian on this. There's a way that we as Christians, particularly those of us who are majority culture Christians, middle class, people whose lives have been, we have our difficulties, we have our struggles, but, we haven't sat in this place of war. We haven't sat in the place of persecution. There's a way of even holding Christianity rightly, even the language of other-centered co-suffering love, that is still very self-centered. And I think the journey of other-centered co-suffering love is always going to do what the title of this book says. This is why I picked this weird phrase. It is always going to take us toward the other. And so Tara's question, what do we do right now? I think that some of the immediate pastoral things I can say are, we don't isolate. We don't turn inward. We look for ways to move toward the other. And it might be in your case that there's people in your circle that are being directly injured. Someone that comes up in my mind as I think about that is fear that, some of us have friends, family, folks in our circle that are queer or trans. And those folks, with the shift that has happened in terms of policy in our country in the last month, those folks are honestly feeling existential fear. Regardless of what you think about the issue, they are feeling existential fear. And so what would it look like to move toward those people in your life, to hear them, to be present to them, to walk with them? And maybe it's in a practical way, like they're saying, I need to run an errand in this part of town and I'm afraid to go there. And you say, okay, let me go with you. Or maybe it's in a friendship way where you create space for them to say what they need to say, where they can be heard, moving toward them. Right. And you could apply that same template to whoever is having to bear the burden that our society is generating right now. Don't isolate, don't move inward to only safe spaces, move toward the other, and perhaps invite Jesus to guide you in who those others are and how you would do that. So I'm going to press pause so that I don't just say too much. I'm going to go. I want Brian and Bradley to speak to this, and I'm going to just echo while we have this bit of conversation. Tara's follow-up question is, but do we speak truth to power? Do we fight the wrongs being perpetrated? What do we do? All right. So which of you is ready to jump in on that?
Yeah, I don't know what you do necessarily. I do know that the practical expression of the kingdom of God is what the church is. And because of its practical nature, it's imperfect, but it's also visible, tangible, and real. I think we get in trouble when we think it is our task to change the world. When the church tries to change the world, the church becomes the world. Because with that very language, we tend to reach for the political coercive means of power. We can call it Caesar's sword. We can call it the ring of power if you want to go all Lords of the Rings. Our task is more modest. Our task is not to change the world. When we try to do that, we become the world with the best of intentions. Our task is to be that part of the world already transformed by Christ. So what do? We work on creating that radical alternative society where love flourishes, where the weak is, where it's blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. The meek inherit the earth, etc. We focus on creating those communities. Jesus calls them the ecclesia, the church, the called out ones, the ones, called out of just their own little private life into some public expression, but it's the public expression called the church, and that is practical. If you want to go beyond that, then that's fine, but that's beyond my scope as a pastor. I speak as a pastor theologian, and I limit it to that because I don't have much more to say. I'm not a political activist. I'm not saying there isn't a place for that. I'm just saying I'm not the guy to talk to about that because that's not what I do. What I actually do is help create and sustain a practical expression of the kingdom of God in the form of a local church. And that is actually more than enough. I mean, that's more than enough work, but I also mean that's how it will be enough. If we think, but we've got to change it like that. I don't know how to do that. I'm not the guy to talk to about that.
I am. Just kidding. I'm with Brian on this. So one of the things that it's a great question. I tried to answer it briefly also in the chat. The idea of, do we speak truth to power? Well, what do we mean by that? First of all, I learned from Brian to ask, who is we? But when I do, it's like, what do I think that is? Like writing Instagram memes? That's not actually speaking truth to power. It's performative usually, and it's cathartic. And that's why I do it a little bit, a little bit, because I think that it has such little impact. I've marched with 1 million people against the second war in Iraq, and it did nothing. I vote in elections, and I'm going to keep doing that, but I'm aware that's like buying a lottery ticket. That's how little impact it was. But the person in front of me today who's suffering, the trans person that I know in my family who's afraid, my black friend who has to check every doorway he enters to see if it's a safe place, knowing I can say, I'm with you no matter what. That has a massive impact. The homeless guy who reached out his arms like this to welcome my son into his arms after he'd been assaulted in the inner city. You know, that these kind of things have a massive impact. So that seems to be a more fruitful way to be Christian in the world. Yeah, sure, sign a petition. I will. But I also am aware of the relative power of, I rewrote a letter to the passport office today for an ex-convict who needed an advocate. Okay, that could have a big impact on him, his wife, and his children. So I measure my time out in those kind of ways, and that's how and my energy, because when I see the fruit of that, I'm energized.
Mm-hmm.
When I see the fruitlessness of the other and my frustrations around it, but like, what about big things like Gaza? Well, give $20 to Mercy Aiken, she'll get food to people.
Yeah,
that's actually going to do something, right? Those kind of things. I think that's very, very practical, but it's the cruciform way is a narrow way that takes one step at a time in co-suffering love, who you can actually walk with in a company.
Let me take a stab at maybe weaving these two together. What if the way Brian encourages us to gather in the local expression of the community of followers of Jesus who are living this new kingdom life? Bradley says, the practical hands-on service and care and advocacy that we do in a one-on-one way is where we can really make a difference. Okay, so maybe the way to weave these together is, what if the church is a place where we come together to talk about this very thing so that we each have courage and spiritual imagination for how we can engage in that one-on-one advocacy and care? What if church is a place that we come together and do a little bit of that Acts 2 pooling of our resources? Maybe those resources are our best ideas, the links to articles that we have, some money. I mean, in my own church situation, recently, some people were able to come together and help a person that desperately needed a vehicle to get to work, get a vehicle. That was Acts 2. Somebody else brings the little immigration red cards that say what exactly you should say to an immigration official when they are acting beyond their constitutional authority, and to say nothing else. And those little cards can be easily distributed to people, right? That's sharing resources. And the fact that we could come together in community and share our questions and our fears, and someone else could say, yes, what about this? I can walk with you in that. Or have you tried this? Then maybe the gathering in the local community embodies Jesus' desire for us to walk the other-centered, co-suffering path. And we can then do more of that individual one-on-one care, love, and advocacy because we are empowered and encouraged, and our spiritual imagination is sparked because we are part of a community who's committed to that. What do you think?
Mark, this is Danny. And I so admire that. And I love that. And I wish I lived where you lived, because that is not happening where I live. I would be there in a heartbeat. And maybe it's the cynic in me, and I don't want to be like Danny Downer. I am doing that. My daughter is a healthcare worker, and I got to tell you, healthcare where I am is just, it's top notch. Healthcare is top notch, but our healthcare providers are drowning. My daughter is drowning in COVID again. Yeah. Okay. So if you think COVID's not out there, it's drowning my kid. And I would love for our churches to be a temple of safety, a haven where we could go. And that's not happening where I live. But I see your posts and I read your emails and everything. And I wish, God, I totally wish, I'm going to cry, that I could be there where you are, because it invigorates me and it makes me have a good week. But that's not where I live. It's not practical. And it makes me
Practical is
so
holding
sad.
your daughter, right? I mean, the service you do in caring for your daughter, that you don't get more practical than that. Uh, and to wipe her tears and to cry with her. And
Ugh,
I have a son in the same boat, and I get it. And so that's what we mean, though. That actually
I
has an
know
impact, you know?
it does.
Yeah.
And I'm so sorry that it was so stressful and I didn't talk the whole time. Mark, you're so lucky I didn't talk the whole time. But I do, honestly, I read your emails and I see what you're doing. And um, I just, I'm East Coast and you're West Coast. And I'm like, I would love to hop on a Zoom and listen to your preach at your, you know, in Portland. And I'm like, it's just not working out for me time wise. But this has been probably one of the most meaningful Zoom calls I have been on in probably 6 months.
Hmm.
So to all of you who are riffing it, Bradley, which is killing me, I'm loving it. Was that Brad or who was that? Brian, I think. But thank you so very much. This has uplifted me. It will take me through a month for sure. So thank you all.
Thanks.
Kind of crazy to end, but thank you very much.
We have a few more questions that are popping up, but I also want to respect and honor people's times this evening, since some of you are in, time zones are such a hassle, right? That some of us.
Earth's round, buddy.
I have a response to a question. So Josh had a contrarian question, which I don't think is
Yeah.
really contrarian. How do you think about or act on the kind of love when the other we're talking about is a fundamentalist or mega right winger, etc.? A couple thoughts on that. One is we're dealing with two different things when it's people versus ideologies. And so if we provide a gospel that is far more beautiful and embracing than the ideologies at work, I think there's a market for that, and those who are hungry for it will come first. Meanwhile, I've found it easier to deal with the left-right spectrum. I can kind of transcend that and build bridges, but when you're moving between dealing with authoritarian things that appear to you like a cult or something, we remember that this is a spectrum too. There are those who just honestly believed we needed a bit of a course correction. And there are others who would like to drive out people of other colors out of the nation. That's a big, big spectrum. So if we can ask questions that act like seeds, and I would pray about that. Lord, would you give me questions that act like seeds? And I don't know when the sprouts will poke through the hard ground. I don't know. But I do think we can waste a lot of time arguing with people when there's already a market for those who are so sick of the conflict that they're ready to talk about Jesus. That's time better served than debating somebody from those other parts. But if we can maintain a few friendships and just say, we see it so differently, I'm going to do my best not to alienate you. If you want that, we'll play the patient route. But in the meantime, there's those who are really hungry for the Jesus way now and ready for that. And that does transcend left and right.
Well, and I think even Danny's comment earlier is a really good example of why it matters for us to talk about this publicly. Danny said, something like, hey, where she is at, where she lives, this conversation is not happening. She's not aware of churches where this kind of conversation is happening. And it feels, she feels disconnected and in needing that. Well, that's exactly the reason why we need to have these conversations in public where other people can hear them. Right.
There's a difference between me being aware versus me not being able. So
yeah,
let's just talk about where I live, right? Like right smack in Ohio, this conversation is not being had at all. I would go somewhere if I knew it could happen. And I grew up with Mark in what used to be what was thought, Mark, one of the most liberal Seventh-day Adventist churches in the country. When you left and your mom left, at some point you didn't even know this, but they decided we were not even part of the Seventh-day Adventist Church because we were so liberal. And we have flipped the entire different way. I would not even consider myself a Seventh-day Adventist at this point.
Yeah.
So what's happening in Ohio is just not even something that I could even fathom.
Is your daughter in Ohio?
Yeah, my daughter lives here. Yes.
What if you were to start a conversation just with her and a couple of the other nurses who are struggling? Just be a non-judgmental ear for them or something.
So my daughter works at the 4th largest hospital. My daughter's a neuro critical care nurse. So it's the 4th largest neuroscience hospital in the country. And several of those nurses are very, very adamant about their feelings about, this feels like a safe space to me. I'm just going to say it, like they're pro-life. They're all about anti-abortion. They're all kinds of things. And they're very, very open about that with their patients and their patients' family, which I feel to be very inappropriate in a hospital setting, in a healthcare setting. And so does my daughter. They have, their political buttons on their nursing, outfits and everything. And I don't think that's appropriate in a nursing healthcare facility. Hospital.
No, I'm not talking about there. I'm just thinking about opening your home to your daughter and saying, are there others who are hurting right now that would want to talk and have it in your like that? That's what I'm talking about. Grassroots stuff.
Hey, Danny.
I think Danny, honestly, go ahead.
Sorry, I have some time commitments that I need to honor, and so I would love to talk more directly.
Yeah, you do. Okay.
If you'd like to chat, you and I would be thrilled to do that.
Thanks, Danny.
The point that I was wanting to make about your share was just what an incredible visceral example it is of the tension people are feeling and how there isn't for many people a place where this conversation is happening. And I think that's why this book, that's why this conversation tonight, that's why I wanted, quite frankly, this is kind of weird to do a conversation like this for a book launch, right? Because a book launch party is supposed to be all celebrating the book and, making it be lots of fun. And here, instead of that, I opened up this difficult conversation, which doesn't feel very much like a party, but this feels essential to me because of the moment that we're in and because of the complexity and nuance of how to follow the other-centered co-suffering way of Jesus, when the fact is that there are a lot of folks wearing the label Christian, many of whom are wearing it in good faith, who see these things differently. And that is creating some of this additional stress and pressure. And so I'm going to actually, as we wrap, I'm going to provide another opportunity that maybe some of you might be interested in. I want to make sure that we have the opportunity to thank the folks that have participated tonight. I know that Susan has a couple of quick things. So let me just give my opportunity and then I'll turn it over to Susan. If this kind of conversation feels important to you and you would like to go further in it, two things. First, like I just offered to Danny, I'm willing to have a pastoral conversation with you particularly. Like we can get on a Zoom or on a FaceTime or on a call or go to a coffee shop if you're here in town and we can talk about this. And I am willing to do that. But the second opportunity is that I am going to host a Lent group that is going to go through Walking Otherward together. And how that will look is that we'll have a shared reading schedule that will take us from Ash Wednesday through the end, through the Passion Week. We will have a weekly Wednesday night Zoom for thinking about and processing that week's readings. That Zoom is going to be at 5:45 Pacific time, and it will be recorded for folks who want that but can't participate at that time. And then all of that is going to be held in a private forum. So not on Facebook, not on Facebook groups. I have a separate private forum that as we're reading the daily readings, we can interact, ask questions, share about the readings, talk about what is happening. You know, Brian put it so wonderfully and mystically that it's possible that as you open this and read the gospel, that maybe you experience the light of Christ and that actually guides you in a way that has nothing to do with me at all and everything to do with what the Spirit is. So I'm going to drop a link in the chat that you can take to sign up for that Lent group if you would like to participate. There's no cost other than you have to have a copy of the book. But even then, if you can't afford the book, I will give you a copy of the book. Okay. Like, buy the book. Yes, please. It took a lot of money for me to make this book. But if you can't afford it, I will give you a copy if you want to participate. I'm going to drop that. I'm going to drop that comment in the chat right now, and then I'm going to turn it over to Susan.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everybody. I do think I would just encourage everybody as we move into this Lenten season, it's kind of the perfect time, right, to lean in to this journey with Jesus, to look daily at what this other-centered co-suffering love means in our lives, and to do that in community. So you could be a part of Mark's group, you could bring that book into a group that you're already a part of and maybe do it together. Leaning into our practices together, I think, is one of the things that's gonna hold us as we move through this time. So this book is a perfect gift at the perfect time. So thank you, Mark. You guys, if you don't have a copy, you can get it all the places. Amazon, Barnes and Noble. It's all on Mark's website. He's also getting to be on some podcasts, and conversations have been awesome. So if you don't follow Mark, you should follow him on socials, and you'll see him posting all that stuff for you there too. So I think that's it for our time tonight. I just want to thank Brian and Bradley for being with us. Super helpful. And if this has stirred up some stuff for you, I get that. And so let's just breathe and pray and trust and lean in to Jesus together. Mark, any last thing you would like to share with folks before we sign off?
Just thanks, gratitude. Writing for me is an act of hospitality and service. And that is always more fun when there are people who receive it. So I'm just so grateful for those of you that that have read and are reading and are following along. That means a lot to me. I want you to know that if you're thinking these kinds of thoughts and you're wanting to know how we as followers of Jesus can live in a path that is more generative in the world, you're not alone in that. You may feel alone. You may be a dot in a geographical region where you feel like everyone is thinking differently than you, but it's not true. You are not alone. And you know, we can connect here. There are other people we can get connected to. Seek that out, because as the intentional chaos that is designed to trigger our limbic systems and push us into fear, as that is unfolded, what we need is community. And that is one of the things that Jesus calls us into. So that's my last word. I want to thank Brian so much for being here tonight, especially with the time zone changes and all of the many, many busy things that you do. It means a lot that you'd be here. Bradley, my friend, thank you so much for being here. I hope that you have a big bottle of NyQuil at hand and you can immediately go knock yourself out. It's a real gift that you would be here tonight, even when you're feeling so horrible. Everybody else, hey, man, thanks so much for being here, for being part of my extended community. Let's maybe try this other-centered co-suffering thing for a while and see if it makes a difference. All right.
Amen.
Good times, Mark. Thanks.
Oh,
Thanks,
bless.
Mark. Hey, Kanawai.
Thank you, Mark.
Hey, Bradley. Good times, Mark. Great show.
Thank you.
Kenneth, I'm so glad that you're here.
Congratulations for the book. Hope to see you soon, Susan. Godspeed.
I hope people will buy a box of them.
I also hope people will buy a box of them.
Why not, right? Start a thing. So
Awesome.
If you didn't get the link in the Zoom chat about the Lent group, I will send it to you since you signed up for this Zoom. I'll just send it to you via that tool so you can get that if you want to follow along. Otherwise, wherever you find yourself in the world tonight, I hope that the rest of your night is peaceful and good, and blessings upon you.